What if the wall everyone said could never fall just fell? Before we go further, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel grow. And if you're new here, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a breakdown like this one. Share this with someone who follows the war closely. Now, let's get into it. For 3 years, there was one place on the map of southern Ukraine that almost nobody talked about because nothing ever happened there. A small settlement surrounded by flat farmland, sitting quietly in the Zaporizhzhia region. To most people, it looked like nothing. But to military analysts, it was one of the most important pieces of ground in the entire war. That settlement is called Malotokmachka. For years, Russian forces transformed this area into one of the most heavily fortified defensive zones on the entire southern front. Layers of trenches, minefields stacked on minefields, bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, fallback positions. It wasn't just a defensive line, it was designed to be the line that could never be broken. The final shield, protecting the road toward the city of Tokmak. And for a long time it worked. The front around Malotokmachka barely moved. Month after month, the same positions, the same stalemate. People started to assume this was just how it would stay, frozen in place, maybe forever. But here's something history keeps proving, over and over again. No defensive line is permanent. Not the Maginot Line, not the trenches of World War I. Every fortress eventually meets a force or a strategy. It wasn't built to stop. And between the 17th and 20th of May, that moment arrived for Malotokmachka. In just a few days, something happened that completely flipped the picture on this part of the map. According to reports from the Institute for the Study of War, Ukrainian forces broke through into the operational depth of Russian positions in the area, not just pushing the line forward a little, going deep, striking behind the defenses, not just in front of them. And the result? Malotokmachka, after 3 years under Russian control, was reportedly liberated. Blue and yellow flags were raised again in streets that had been frozen in conflict for years. But this wasn't an isolated win. At the same time, just to the east, another settlement called Bilohirya was also secured. This wasn't a coincidence, it was coordinated. 2 key points falling together in a single connected operation. To understand why this matters so much, we need to go back. Because Ukraine didn't just walk into Malotokmachka by luck, they tried before, and the first time, it didn't go well. 3 years earlier, in the summer, Ukraine launched its first major attempt to break through this exact area. The plan back then was simple and bold. Hit the Russian lines hard and fast, using newly delivered Western armor, and punch straight through before the enemy could react. For this mission, Ukraine sent in its 47th Mechanized Brigade, one of the best equipped and best trained units in the entire army at that time. Their vehicles included German-made Leopard 2A4 and Leopard 2A6 tanks, alongside American Bradley fighting vehicles. On paper, this was a serious force. The plan was for this armored wave to smash through Russian defenses by sheer force. But Russian engineers had spent months preparing for exactly this. They had laid down one of the densest, most complex minefields seen in modern warfare, layered across the approach to Malotokmachka. The result was brutal. Ukrainian forces suffered heavy losses. The armored push barely advanced a few kilometers before grinding to a halt. It would have been easy to call that the end of the story. A failed attack, heavy losses, lessons learned the hard way. But here's the thing about modern militaries that actually adapt. They don't just retreat and forget. They study what went wrong piece by piece, and they rebuild their approach from scratch. And that's exactly what happened. Over the following years, the Ukrainian military quietly shifted its entire approach to this kind of operation. Instead of relying on heavy armored columns rushing straight into prepared defenses, they began building something different. A combination of drones, electronic warfare, and small, highly mobile infantry units that could move fast and strike precisely. So, when the calendar reached the 20th of May, Ukraine returned to Malotokmachka. But this time, it wasn't the 47th Brigade leading the charge. This time, it was the 118th Mechanized Brigade, and they came with a completely different kind of operation. It didn't start with artillery, it started with silence. In the days before the assault, Ukrainian drone operators flew quiet reconnaissance missions over the area, using thermal and optical sensors to build an incredibly detailed map of the Russian defenses below. Every command post, every hidden artillery position, every camouflaged supply depot, every spot where Russian troops were gathering. All of it was mapped out, piece by piece, with remarkable precision. This wasn't guesswork. This was a complete digital picture of the enemy's defenses, built before a single shot was fired. Once that intelligence was ready, it was fed straight into Ukraine's electronic warfare units. And then came the next phase, the one that changed everything. Powerful jamming systems were activated across the area, blinding every radio frequency and local radar network the Russian forces were using. In an instant, communication between Russian frontline positions and their command centers in the rear was cut off. Imagine being a soldier on the front line and suddenly your radio goes dead. You can't call for backup. You can't report what's happening. You can't coordinate with the units next to you. You're alone, blind, and the enemy knows exactly where you are. In military terms, this is called operational isolation, and it's one of the most dangerous situations any unit can find itself in. That's exactly what happened to Russian forces in Malotokmachka. With communications down, Ukrainian artillery took over, but these weren't random strikes on trenches. These were precision hits on the coordinates that had already been mapped out: ammunition depots, electronic warfare vehicles, communication hubs. Within a very short time, Russia's ability to coordinate fire, resupply, and respond had been reduced to almost nothing. Then came the final phase. Ukrainian mechanized infantry from the 118th Brigade moved in, breaking into small independent tactical teams. These units pushed into the settlement, using the chaos of urban combat to their advantage, isolating Russian positions one by one and neutralizing them. This approach made something very important happen. It made Russia's numerical advantage in troops almost meaningless. It didn't matter how many soldiers Russia had in the area if those soldiers couldn't communicate, couldn't coordinate, and couldn't see what was coming. Faced with this pressure, Russian forces were pushed out of the settlement entirely. Units from Russia's 58th Combined Arms Army couldn't hold their operational structure under this kind of combined air and ground pressure. The 42nd Guards Motor Rifle Division, tasked with holding the line, reportedly couldn't even organize a proper retreat. Their command broke down and units scattered. Even Russia's VDV airborne forces, often considered among the most elite, couldn't hold their positions against this level of pressure. The 71st and 291st Motor Rifle Regiments stationed in the area were hit just as hard. Heavy losses in personnel and equipment forced these units to abandon their positions and retreat south. And here's the part that really matters. Ukraine didn't just take back the town itself. At the same time, they cut through the T-08-115 highway, one of the most critical transport routes on the entire southern axis. Pushing past this highway gave Ukraine something incredibly valuable: a secure tactical foothold reaching into Russia's defensive depth. With control over the T-08-15, Ukrainian forces now have a much safer launching point for future operations, heading further south. In other words, Russia didn't just lose a town, they lost a town and a major supply artery at the same time. Now Ukrainian forces have the ability to position surveillance systems, electronic warfare equipment, and drone launch platforms with much less risk. This new, unobstructed line of sight allows Ukrainian troops to monitor a huge stretch of territory to the south, like it's right there in the palm of their hand, and to strike it almost instantly if needed. And right in the center of that newly visible territory sits the city of Tokmak. If you've been enjoying this breakdown so far, do me a quick favor, smash that like button. It tells YouTube to show this video to more people who care about this conflict. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because we're about to get into the part that really matters. Tokmak is the military, logistical, and operational heart of the Russian army on the Zaporizhzhia front. This city is the main distribution center supplying ammunition to all Russian military operations in the south. It coordinates evacuations of wounded soldiers. It keeps the entire system running. Heavy ammunition trains, fuel tankers, fresh troop convoys arriving from Crimea or eastern regions, all of it gathers here first. Now think about what just happened. Ukraine's new forward position has brought Tokmak and everything around it directly within range of Ukrainian artillery. Advanced long-range artillery systems, multiple rocket launchers, and heavy attack drones can now monitor logistical movement around Tokmak day and night. This constant threat of surveillance and strikes makes it incredibly dangerous for Russian forces to safely use their ammunition depots. Russian command is essentially being forced to pull combat troops away from the front line, just to protect this distribution hub instead. But here's where it gets even bigger. The defense of Tokmak isn't just a local problem for that one region. It's directly connected to the military presence and stability of the entire southern front, all the way to Crimea. Because this growing pressure toward Tokmak ultimately threatens the main supply routes leading to the city of Melitopol. Melitopol is the largest administrative, political, and logistical center of the land corridor Russia, established by force. In particular, the railway line running through Novobodanivka station directly to Melitopol is critically important. This is the only route capable of transporting heavy armored vehicles and large quantities of artillery shells to the front. Because Russian military doctrine has historically depended heavily on rail transport, securing this railway line is important. It is enough to determine the fate of the entire frontline operation. Thousands of tons of ammunition and fuel that the army needs simply cannot be delivered to the front sustainably without these railways. The M14 highway, running parallel to this same route, is another vital artery, constantly used for the rapid deployment of units. This increased firepower capability that Ukraine now has, extending south through Tokmak, is shaking Russia's entire southern logistics architecture. because the risk of these railway lines being directly hit forces the Russian army into much slower road transport instead. Moving the cargo that a single train can carry in one trip requires hundreds of military trucks by road, and that makes the entire supply chain incredibly fragile. But Ukraine's operational planning doesn't stop at the Zaporizhzhia axis. It extends into a much wider strategic area. Because at the same time Ukraine is applying pressure toward Tokmak, they're also targeting distant alternative supply routes. In particular, other long-distance arteries supplying Crimea from the mainland have become a major focus. The R280 highway, which begins in Rostov-on-Don and stretches to Crimea through occupied Mariupol and Berdyansk, sits at the top. This route had become practically the only indispensable lifeline for the Russian army. For a long time, this was the safe, fast corridor through which Russian military transports flowed most intensively. But now, Ukraine's military is turning traffic on this highway into a complete nightmare for occupying forces. Using long-range FPV drones and autonomous attack systems, they are paralyzing deliveries along the highway. Especially within the occupied Kherson region, Russian military transport vehicles are being relentlessly hunted by drones. This situation, in turn, is bringing logistics flow behind the front line to a complete standstill. This crisis has even become a topic of conversation for occupation officials in the region. Vladimir Saldo, head of the Russian-installed administration in the Kherson region, could no longer hide this massive problem. On the 21st of May, Saldo completely banned civilian truck and freight traffic on the most critical stretches of the R280 highway. Specifically targeted were the long, vulnerable sections between the 463rd and 494th kilometer markers. Both of these traffic arteries were closed indefinitely to all commercial and civilian traffic, except for approved military shipments. Administrative bans like this are some of the most concrete evidence we've seen that drone operations are having a real impact. Because the combat strength of an army isn't measured only by how many tanks it has. It's measured by how much fuel and ammunition it can actually deliver to those tanks on time. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about understanding what's really happening here, not just headlines. So here's your CTA for this part. Drop a comment below telling us what you think happens next. Your comments genuinely shape what we cover in future videos. With this remarkably precise military strategy, Ukraine has achieved a direct tactical armored advance on one side of the front. But the process that started with Malotokmachka actually shows us something much bigger. This remarkable local military success isn't just about changing the color of one village on a map. This is the most critical and successful step of a much larger war of attrition strategy, one that spans the entire southern front, and is specifically aimed at undermining Russia's military logistics. While Russian command scrambles in a kind of panic, moving troops from other fronts to cover this one vulnerability, Ukrainian intelligence can immediately detect these newly weakened lines and prepare its next devastating wave of attacks. What's more, a Russian army that's constantly trying to plug gaps by staying on the defensive can lose all of its proactive capability. This asymmetric, technology-focused style of operating represents the collapse of something much bigger, the rigid, centralized, rail-dependent command structure that Russia's military has relied on for decades. As of May 2026, this new situation, created by this operational breakthrough, could produce far more extensive results. Ukrainian forces can continue their reconnaissance activities and electronic warfare operations along these newly captured lines. But the bigger picture goes far beyond that. Kyiv is seizing the chance to show that the land bridge might not stay the same, which means this major tactical advantage gained on the southern axis could have far more surprising effects than anyone expected. So let's bring this all together. The changing flags and the recently liberated streets of Malotokmachka prove something important. Military history can change in the blink of an eye. Ukraine may have just seized an opportunity along the southern front lines that it hasn't been able to reach for a long time. Now the only real question left is what happens next. It seems Kyiv has two options ahead of it. The first is to establish full control over the entire Zaporizhzhia line, building on this momentum that began with Malotokmachka. The other option is to shift focus toward Crimea while continuing pressure here at the same time. A double pincer movement hitting from two directions at once. Of course, many different scenarios could unfold from here. But right now, at least for the moment, the situation doesn't look very encouraging for Russia. So tell us, what do you think happens next? Drop your thoughts in the comments, we read every single one. And they genuinely help guide what we cover next. And if this video helped you understand the bigger picture, do one last thing for us, share it with someone who'd find this interesting. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.